September 1941. The enemy is 3 kilometers from the Kirov plant. Workers grab their rifles and stand guard at the gates of their factory. The plant becomes a fortress. Machine operators turn into soldiers. Every day is under fire. Every night is spent waiting for an assault. Production does not stop. Tanks go into battle straight from the workshops. This is the story of how the workers' battalions of Leningrad defended the factories that became the last line of defense. Proletarians with rifles against the regular army of the Wehrmacht. An incredible feat that everyone should know about. If you are interested in the history of the Great Patriotic War, the unknown pages of the defense of Leningrad, and the feats of ordinary people, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Now, here's a question for discussion in the comments. Could the workers' battalions, which had no military training and insufficient weapons, really stop the German army in the event of an assault on the factory? Or was it more of a moral stance taken by the doomed defenders? Share your opinion. In the summer of 1941, Leningrad remained one of the largest industrial centers of the Soviet Union. The city on the Neva River, with a population of about 3 million, was not only a cultural capital, but also a powerful industrial complex, producing tanks, artillery, ships, and aviation equipment. Hundreds of plants and factories worked around the clock to meet the country's needs. Among them, the Kirov plant, a giant of heavy engineering that had become a symbol of Leningrad's industrial power, occupied a special place. With the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War on June 22, 1941, the life of the city changed dramatically. In the first days of the war, thousands of Leningraders submitted applications requesting to be sent to the front. Factories switched to wartime production, increasing the output of weapons and military equipment. The evacuation of some equipment and the population began, but most enterprises continued to operate on site, understanding their strategic importance for the country's defense. The city authorities and the command of the Leningrad front prepared for a possible siege. Defensive lines were built, food reserves were created, and air defense was organized. Hundreds of thousands of Leningraders, workers, employees, students, and school children were mobilized to build fortifications around the city. They dug trenches, erected pillboxes and bunkers, and installed anti-tank barriers. The work was carried out around the clock, in the most difficult conditions, but no one complained. Everyone understood that the fate of the city and the country was at stake. Special attention was paid to the formation of a people's militia. Already in July 1941, the creation of people's militia divisions from among volunteers began in Leningrad. Factory and plant workers, intellectuals, students, anyone who could hold a weapon signed up for the militia. These people had no military experience, but they were ready to defend their city at any cost. Among the first units formed was the 1st Kirov Division of the People's Militia, created from workers at the Kirov plant. In August 1941, the situation on the approaches to Leningrad was becoming increasingly threatening. German troops of Army Group North were rapidly advancing towards the city, overcoming the resistance of Soviet troops. The Luga defensive line, held by militiamen and regular troops, was the last serious obstacle in the enemy's path. It was here, on the Luga line, that the Kirov militiamen fought their first battle, showing courage and fortitude. By the end of August, it became clear that a blockade was inevitable. The enemy was approaching the city from 3 sides, cutting off retreat and supply routes. Under these conditions, a decision was made to form workers' battalions to defend industrial enterprises. The factories were to become fortresses, capable not only of producing weapons, but also of defending themselves against the enemy. Preparations began for the defense that would determine the fate of Leningrad for the next 900 days. At the beginning of the war, the Kirov plant was the largest heavy machinery manufacturing enterprise in the Soviet Union. Its history began in the 18th century, when the Putilov plant was founded here, but its real heyday came during the Soviet era. In the 1930s, the enterprise was renamed in honor of Sergei Mironovich Kirov and became the main manufacturer of tanks for the Red Army. Dozens of workshops, warehouses, administrative buildings, and railroad tracks were located on an area of several square kilometers. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, about 33,000 people worked at the Kirov plant. The plant produced more than 50 tanks per month, as well as artillery pieces, tractors, and other heavy equipment. The factory's particular pride was the KV heavy tank, named after Kliment Voroshilov. This tank, with its powerful armor and weaponry, became a real nightmare for German troops in the first months of the war. The Wehrmacht's 37 mm anti-tank guns could not penetrate its armor, and the Germans had to use 80-80 anti-aircraft guns to combat the KV. The location of the plant made it strategically important, but also extremely vulnerable. The enterprise was located on the southern outskirts of Leningrad, in the Kirovsky district, not far from the Gulf of Finland. When German troops broke through to the coast near Strelna in September 1941, the factory was only 3 kilometers from the front line. German artillery could fire directly at the factory workshops, and enemy scouts observed the factory grounds through binoculars. The German command was well aware of the importance of the Kirovsky factory for the defense of Leningrad. The destruction or capture of the factory would deprive Soviet troops of a vital source of tanks and other weapons. In August 1941, Adolf Hitler himself emphasized the need to capture Leningrad, pointing out that the city was home to the only factory producing super-heavy tanks. This was an exaggeration. KV tanks were also produced in Chelyabinsk, but in 1941, the Kirov plant was indeed the main manufacturer of these vehicles. From the first days of the war, the plant's management took measures to increase the production of military products and prepare for a possible defense. Plant director Isaac Moisevich Zaltzman and chief designer of the Tank Design Bureau, Joseph Yakovlevich Kotin, organized round-the-clock work in all workshops. The production of KV tanks was put on stream. During the first 3 months of the war, from June to August 1941, the factory produced 492 KV tanks, compared to 393 vehicles assembled in the previous 6 months. Simultaneously with the increase in production, a partial evacuation of equipment and specialists began. In July 1941, part of the production capacity was sent to Chelyabinsk, where a branch of the enterprise was being formed. However, the main workshops continued to operate in Leningrad. The workers and engineers of the Kirov plant understood that the fate of the city and the front depended on their labor. They were prepared not only to produce equipment, but also to defend their plant with weapons in their hands if the enemy approached the factory gates. In August 1941, when the threat to Leningrad became apparent, the city leadership decided to form mass workers' battalions. These units were created to defend the city's industrial enterprises and strategic facilities. Unlike the divisions of the People's Militia, which were sent to the front, The workers' battalions were to defend the plants and factories directly on their territory. The formation took place in an extremely short time. Most of the battalions were created between August 19th and 21, 1941. A total of 79 workers' battalions were formed in Leningrad and its suburbs, with a total strength of over 40,000 people. 49 battalions were created in August for the internal defense of the city. Each battalion was formed on the basis of one or more enterprises and consisted of workers, engineers, and employees of these factories. People volunteered for the battalions, understanding the seriousness of the situation. Many of them already had military experience, having served in the Red Army in peacetime, but most were taking up arms for the first time. At the Kirov plant, the formation of workers' battalions began at the end of August 1941. 3 rifle companies, 1 machine gun company, 1 tank company, an artillery division, and a mortar platoon were formed from among the workers and engineers. 3 companies were also formed to fight enemy airborne troops. The total number of factory defenders was several thousand people. The commanders were former military personnel with experience in the Red Army, as well as communists and Komsomol members who had demonstrated organizational skills. The training of the workers' battalions took place under extremely difficult conditions. There was little time for preparation. The enemy was rapidly approaching the city. Classes were held directly on the factory premises during free time. The workers mastered the Mosin rifle model, 1891 to 1930, Degtyaryov machine guns, and hand grenades model, 1942. They learned to shoot, dig trenches, set up firing positions, and operate as part of a squad and platoon. The instructors were career military personnel and experienced Red Army soldiers seconded from the front to train the militia. Particular attention was paid to the tactics of defending industrial facilities. The workers learned how to turn factory workshops into strongholds, how to use technological equipment to create shelters and barricades, and how to organize a circular defense. Many of them were familiar with the factory territory, down to the smallest detail. They knew every workshop, every basement, every nook and cranny. This knowledge became an important advantage in defense. The workers understood that if the enemy broke through, they would have to fight literally at the gates of their enterprises, defending not only the factory, but also their homes and families. The weapons of the workers' battalions were varied, but often insufficient. There was a shortage of rifles and ammunition, and many fighters received weapons only just before the battle. They used captured weapons, hunting rifles, and even training rifles. But despite all the difficulties, the morale of the battalion was high. They were ready to defend their city and their factory at any cost, even if it meant taking up arms against the regular German army. The 1st Kirov Division of the People's Militia was one of the first large formations created in Leningrad to defend the city. Its formation began at the end of June 1941, immediately after the start of the war. The division was made up of workers from the Kirov plant, as well as residents of the Kirov district of Leningrad. More than 10,000 people submitted applications requesting to be enrolled in the militia. They were workers, engineers, employees, students, anyone who could bear arms and was ready to defend their city. The division was formed on a territorial basis and included several regiments, artillery battalions, and support units. The first to be formed was the 1st Rifle Regiment of the People's Militia, consisting entirely of Kirov workers. Former officers who had fought in the Civil War or had military training were appointed as commanders. Party workers from the factory became commissars. The militia underwent accelerated training, with only a few weeks allocated for preparation. The division's armament was incomplete and heterogeneous. Many militiamen received old-model rifles, and some of the fighters had no personal weapons at all. The artillery consisted of obsolete guns taken from warehouses and training grounds. There was a shortage of vehicles, communications equipment, and medical supplies. But despite all these difficulties, the militia's morale was high. They went to the front to defend their city, their families, and their country. Many of them understood that not all of them would return, but that did not stop them. In July 1941, the 1st Kirov Division was sent to the Luga defensive line, a system of fortifications stretching for about 300 kilometers that covered the approaches to Leningrad from the south. Here, on the Luga River and around the city of the same name, fierce battles unfolded. German troops from Army Group North attempted to break through the defenses and reach Leningrad, but met with stubborn resistance. Kirov militiamen took up positions in the Kingisepp area and held the line together with regular Red Army units. The fighting on the Luga front continued from July 10th to August 24, 1941. The militiamen of the 1st Kirov Division faced the regular German army for the first time and proved themselves to be tenacious fighters. They repelled attacks by infantry and tanks, fought defensive battles while surrounded, and launched counterattacks. The division suffered heavy losses. Many militiamen were killed or wounded, but accomplished its task, delaying the enemy's advance for several weeks. This time was used to strengthen the defenses directly outside the walls of Leningrad. The surviving militiamen of the 1st Kirov Division returned to Leningrad and joined regular units or workers' battalions. Many of them continued to defend the Kirov plant, using the combat experience they had gained on the Luga line. Their comrades who remained to work at the plant formed new units and prepared to defend the enterprise. Everyone understood that the enemy had come close to the city, and that decisive battles would take place at the very walls of Leningrad's plants and factories. September 1941 was a critical month for Leningrad and the Kirov plant. On September 8th, German troops captured Schleiselberg and cut off the last land route connecting the city with the rest of the country. The blockade began, which would last 872 days. At the same time, the enemy broke through to the southern outskirts of Leningrad. The German 4th Panzer Group reached the coast of the Gulf of Finland near Strelna and stopped just 3 kilometers from the walls of the Kirov plant. The plant found itself on the front line of the city's defense. On September 9, 1941, the first massive bombing of the Kirov plant began. German aircraft dropped hundreds of incendiary and high-explosive bombs on the factory grounds. 7 air raid sirens sounded that day, forcing workers to stop work and run to shelters. On September 10th, 8 alarms were sounded, and on the 12th, 10. Bombs weighing up to 1 ton exploded right in the workshops, destroying equipment and killing people. Fires broke out, which were extinguished right under the bombardment. The plant was enveloped in smoke and dust from the explosions. Simultaneously with the air raids, artillery bombardment began. German batteries methodically shelled the factory territory with shells up to 220 mm in caliber. The enemy artillerymen were tasked with putting the enterprise out of action at any cost. Shells exploded in workshops, warehouses, and administrative buildings. The factory grounds turned into a war zone. Workers continued to labor under fire, while soldiers from the workers' battalions took up defensive positions, preparing to repel a possible assault. On September 12, 1941, a defense headquarters was established at the factory. It was headed by the factory director, Isaac Moisevich Salzman, the party secretary, and the commanders of the workers' detachments. The headquarters directed local air defense, organized firefighting, and coordinated the actions of combat units. Round-the-clock communication with the Leningrad Front Command was established. Medical stations were set up on the factory grounds to provide assistance to the wounded. Civil defense fighters were organized to stand guard on the roofs of the workshops, where they used special tongs to drop incendiary bombs into boxes of sand. During those days, a KV tank stood in full combat readiness at the factory gate. The crew was nearby, ready to take their places and engage in battle at any moment. It was a symbol of readiness for the final battle. If the enemy broke through the defensive lines, the tank would meet them with direct fire at the factory gates. Machine gun nests, rifle pits, and trenches for the workers' militia were set up around the gate. Barricades made of metal structures blocked the approaches to the factory. Everything was ready to repel an assault. Despite the bombing and shelling, tank production continued. The workshops worked around the clock. Workers left their shelters after air raid sirens and returned to their machines. They assembled tanks, manufactured shells, and repaired damaged equipment. Every day, new vehicles left the factory gates and headed straight for the front line, which was 3 kilometers away. The factory workers would say, "I'm going to the Kirovsky factory," but it sounded like, "I'm going to the front." The factory and the front merged in September 1941. The transformation of the Kirov plant into a real fortress began in August 1941, but the work became particularly intense in September, when the enemy approached. Workers and soldiers from the workers' battalions, under the guidance of military engineers, created a system of fortifications that was supposed to turn the factory grounds into an impregnable bastion. Work was carried out around the clock, often under bombardment and artillery fire. People worked with incredible tenacity, understanding that their lives and the fate of the factory depended on the quality of the fortifications. 512 rifle embrasures were built on and around the factory grounds, cut directly into the walls of the production buildings. The massive brick walls of the workshops were turned into defensive positions. Openings were cut for firing, embrasures were reinforced with metal sheets, and protected areas for fighters were created inside the buildings. 115 machine gun nests were equipped inside the factory buildings. Maxim machine guns of the 1910 model and Degtyaryov submachine guns were installed to provide circular defense and crossfire. Outside the buildings, 37 full-profile rifle trenches were dug. These were trenches about 1.5 meters deep, with parapets and communication passages. The trenches were located at key points, at the gates, along the fence, near warehouses, and administrative buildings. 17 artillery pillboxes and dugouts were erected to house anti-tank guns and mortars. These firing points were built of reinforced concrete and could withstand a direct hit from an artillery shell. The embrasures were oriented towards the likely directions of enemy attack. Particular attention was paid to anti-tank defense. 650 anti-tank hedgehogs were installed around the perimeter of the factory and on internal roads. These structures, made of metal beams and rails weighing up to 300 kilograms each, could stop a tank or force it to find a detour, exposing it to anti-tank gunfire. The hedgehogs were made directly at the factory from scrap materials. Scraps of rails, metal pipes, and beams were used. Welding crews worked day and night to create these formidable barriers. 1,053 meters of metal barricades with loopholes were erected around the factory. The barricades were constructed according to a special design. They were located on both sides of the active passageways so as not to interfere with the movement of factory transport. But in case of danger, it was possible to quickly block the road by removing just one element of the structure. The barricades were made from railroad wheels, rails, scrap metal, and concrete blocks. They had embrasures cut into them for firing. These structures became a characteristic feature of the Kirov plant's defenses. The approaches to the plant were mined, wire barriers were installed, and barricades were created from logs and metal structures. Engineering units of the Leningrad front helped the workers to build defensive structures. Based on the experience of fortifying the Kirov plant, defensive positions were built at other enterprises in Leningrad. The plant became a model of how an industrial facility can be turned into a fortress capable not only of producing weapons, but also of defending itself against the enemy. Every workshop, every building, every section of the territory was ready for defense. Life and work at the Kirov plant, with the front line just 3 kilometers away, was a test of human endurance. German observation posts were so close that enemy artillerymen could adjust their fire by observing the plant through their optics. Every movement on the factory grounds, every puff of smoke from a chimney, every transport of equipment immediately provoked artillery fire. The workers and defenders of the factory learned to live in this hell, continuing to do their duty. The artillery fire was almost continuous. German batteries fired methodically at factory workshops, warehouses, and railroad tracks. Shells of all calibers were used, from 75 mm to 220 mm. Heavy shells were particularly destructive, piercing the roofs of the workshops and exploding inside, destroying equipment and people. But production did not stop. The workers learned to determine the moment of firing of the enemy battery and managed to take cover in protected areas of the workshop before the shell reached its target. The air raids continued with the same intensity. German aircraft bombed the factory almost daily. Air raid sirens sounded 10 to 15 times a day. Workers descended into bomb shelters that had been set up in the basements of the factory buildings. These shelters could accommodate several thousand people, but conditions in them were difficult, cramped, stuffy, and damp. People spent hours there waiting for the raid to end. Then they returned to their machines and continued working until the next alarm sounded. Despite all the dangers, the factory continued to produce tanks and other military equipment. In September-October 1941, production was at its peak. KV tanks were assembled literally under enemy fire. Some vehicles were damaged by shrapnel right in the assembly shop, but they were repaired and sent to the front. Finished tanks did not accumulate on the factory premises. They were immediately transported to the nearby front line. The tanks went into battle straight from the factory gates, sometimes not even fully equipped. Not only the production workshops were working, but also the repair shops. Tanks damaged in battle were delivered to the factory, where they were repaired and returned to service. The repairmen worked at an incredible speed. Every repaired vehicle was worth its weight in gold. 3 mobile repair brigades were created: PRB 21, 22, and 23. These brigades went directly to the battlefield, where they repaired tanks under enemy fire and evacuated damaged vehicles. 2 brigades worked on the Leningrad front, and 1 was sent to the Western Front. Life at the factory became a constant balancing act between production and defense. Workers combined their work at the machines with duty in the workers' detachments. A shift at the factory could be followed by a shift at a firing position. People hardly ever left the factory grounds. Many lived in dormitories or directly in the workshops. The factory became not just a place of work for them, but a home, a fortress that they defended with weapons in their hands. The phrase, "I'm going to the Kirov factory," became synonymous with, "I'm going to the front." There was no rear here. This was the front line. The workers' detachments of the Kirov plant repeatedly engaged in direct combat with the enemy. 3 rifle companies, a machine gun company, and other units formed from the plant's workers not only guarded the territory of the enterprise, but also participated in repelling enemy attacks, fought sabotage groups, and conducted reconnaissance. These people, who until recently had been machine operators, mechanics, and engineers, became real soldiers, ready to defend their factory at the cost of their own lives. Particularly intense battles took place in September-October 1941, when German troops attempted to break through to the center of Leningrad through the southern districts of the city. The enemy sought to capture the Kirov plant, which was not only an important industrial facility, but also a defensive hub on this section of the front. German intelligence repeatedly attempted to infiltrate the factory, sending in sabotage groups. The saboteurs' task was to blow up key workshops, destroy warehouses with finished products, and disable power equipment. Workers' militia units constantly patrolled the factory grounds and surrounding areas. Guards and lookouts were posted, and ambushes were organized. Several times, enemy reconnaissance and sabotage groups were detected and destroyed or captured. In one such clash, a group of young workers on night duty noticed movement near the factory fence. They called for reinforcements, surrounded the saboteurs, and after a short battle took them prisoner. The captured documents showed that the enemy was preparing a major sabotage operation at one of the key workshops. The workers' detachments cooperated with regular units of the Red Army, which defended the approaches to the factory. The factory fighters knew the area well, including all the passages and driveways and the peculiarities of the terrain. This knowledge was used in organizing the defense and conducting counterattacks. When the enemy tried to approach the factory, the workers' detachments took up pre-prepared positions and opened fire, preventing the enemy from gaining a foothold on the lines they had reached. Machine gunners fired accurately from embrasures equipped in the walls of the workshops, while riflemen hit targets from trenches and foxholes. A tank company formed from factory workers played a special role. It consisted of KV tanks assembled at the factory and crews recruited from volunteers. These tankers underwent accelerated training and were ready at any moment to move out to defend the factory. Several times, the tank company participated in counterattacks, supporting regular units. The tanks left the factory gates and went into battle literally a few hundred meters from the gate. After the battle, they returned to the factory grounds where they were repaired and prepared for the next sortie. An artillery division formed from factory workers was transferred to the Pulkovo Heights, a key defensive point on the southern approaches to Leningrad. From here, they had a view of the territory captured by the enemy, and the artillerymen fired on enemy positions. The division fought throughout the war, reached Berlin, and ended its combat mission in May 1945. But its foundation was laid at the Kirov plant in the fall of 1941, when workers with rifles became soldiers. One of the unique features of the defense of Leningrad was the mobile repair brigades of the Kirov plant, which worked directly on the front lines. These brigades were created in the fall of 1941 from among the best specialists of the enterprise: mechanics, fitters, welders, and engineers. Their task was to repair and evacuate damaged tanks directly in the combat zone. The work required not only high qualifications, but also tremendous courage, as they had to work under enemy fire, often just a few meters from enemy positions. A total of 3 mobile repair brigades were formed: PRB 21, PRB 22, and PRB 23. Each brigade consisted of several dozen specialists and was equipped with the necessary equipment and tools. The brigades included mobile workshops on truck chassis, welding units, trucks with spare parts, and evacuation vehicles. 2 teams, 21 and 22, were sent to the Leningrad front, while the 3rd team, number 23, went to the Western Front, where tanks manufactured by the Kirov plant were also used. The work of the mobile repair teams began immediately after the battle, and sometimes even during it. As soon as a tank was damaged, and the crew reported that the vehicle was out of order, a team was dispatched to the site. Specialists assessed the nature of the damage and decided whether the tank could be repaired on the spot or needed to be evacuated to the factory. If the damage was not critical, a punctured track, one of the instruments out of order, damaged weapons, repairs were carried out right in the field. Working conditions were extremely difficult. Repairmen worked in open terrain, often under fire from enemy artillery and snipers. They had to work at night by the light of lanterns, covered so as not to reveal their position. In winter, their hands froze from the cold, but they had to perform precise work, replacing parts, welding, and adjusting mechanisms. In summer, under the scorching sun, the metal of the tank became so hot that it was impossible to touch it with bare hands. But the crews coped, returning dozens of tanks to service. Many tanks were so badly damaged that they had to be evacuated to the factory for major repairs. In these cases, tractors and evacuation vehicles were used. The damaged tank was hooked up with cables and towed across the front line to the factory. This operation was very dangerous. The convoy moved slowly and was an easy target for enemy artillery. But the repairmen learned to choose routes and times for evacuation, using the terrain and darkness to hide from enemy observation. At the Kirov plant, the evacuated tanks underwent a complete restoration cycle. Damaged components and assemblies were replaced, armor was repaired, and weapons were restored. Thanks to the work of mobile repair crews and the plant's repair shops, many tanks returned to service several times. There were vehicles that burned, received dozens of holes, lost tracks, but were repaired again and again and went into battle. Mobile repair crews became a living link between the plant and the front, ensuring the continuity of combat operations and the maximum use of military equipment. The production of tanks and other military equipment at the Kirov plant under the conditions of the blockade was a real feat. The plant operated literally on the front lines, under constant enemy fire, surrounded with a shortage of raw materials, electricity, and food. But despite all these incredible difficulties, production continued. During the first 3 months of the war, from June to August 1941, the plant produced 492 KV tanks. This was a record that exceeded pre-war figures. Every tank counted. Every machine went straight into battle. The KV tank was the pride of Soviet tank building and a nightmare for German troops. Its armor, up to 90 millimeters thick, could not be penetrated by standard German anti-tank guns. The 85 millimeter gun could hit any German tank at a distance of up to 1.5 kilometers. The vehicle weighed up to 47 tons, making it heavier than any enemy tank. German soldiers called the KV Gespenst, ghost, because of its invulnerability and sudden appearance on the battlefield. The production of the KV required complex technology and highly skilled workers. It was necessary to cast and process thick armor plates, assemble the hull and turret, install a 600 horsepower engine, and mount weapons and observation devices. Each operation required precision and experience. The workers at the Kirov plant possessed these qualities in full. Many of them had worked at the plant for decades, passing on their professional skills to subsequent generations. With the start of the blockade, production conditions deteriorated sharply. Supplies of raw materials and components from other regions of the country ceased. It was necessary to find substitutes, use reserves, and organize the production of missing parts directly at the plant. There was a shortage of electricity. It was supplied on a schedule and was often cut off. Then the workers switched to manual labor, using primitive tools where machines had previously been used. In winter, it was so cold in the workshops that the oil froze and the metal broke on impact. But people continued to work. The most terrible ordeal was hunger. Bread rations were constantly reduced. By November 1941, workers were receiving 250 grams of bread per day, while the rest of the population received 125 grams. This was catastrophically insufficient. People grew weaker, and many collapsed from exhaustion right at their workbenches. But even under these conditions, the factory did not stop. The workers understood that every tank and every shell brought victory closer and gave the city a chance of salvation. They worked to the limit of their strength, overcoming hunger, cold, and fear of death. During the blockade, the Kirov plant produced more than 700 KV tanks and their modifications. These were the KV-1 and KV-1S tanks with a more powerful gun, and the KV-8 flamethrower tank. In addition to tanks, self-propelled artillery units, armored cars, mortars, and shells were also produced. The plant became a universal military enterprise capable of producing virtually any weapon. Tanks assembled at the Kirov plant fought on all fronts, near Moscow and Stalingrad, at the Kursk Bulge, and in the Berlin operation. They became a symbol of the Soviet people's unyielding will to victory. The history of the defense of the Kirov plant is filled with examples of incredible heroism by ordinary workers, engineers, and workers' militia fighters. These people performed feats every day, without expecting rewards or recognition, simply doing their duty. Their names should be as well known as those of famous commanders, because it was they, workers with rifles, who stood to the death at the gates of their factories and did not let the enemy into the city. Turner Alexander Fedorovich Andreev had worked at the factory since his youth, and by the beginning of the war was one of the most experienced masters. When the blockade began, he not only continued to meet his production quota, but also joined a workers' detachment. During one of the shellings, a shell hit the workshop where Andreev was working. The blast threw him against the wall and covered him with debris. His comrades pulled him out from under the rubble and helped him. But as soon as the shelling ended, Andreev returned to his machine and continued working. When asked why he wasn't going to the medical station, he simply replied, "The plan is on fire. The tank is waiting at the front." Mechanic Pyotr Ivanovich Morozov was one of the best specialists in tank engine repair. When Mobile Repair Brigade number 21 was formed, he joined it. Morozov took part in dozens of trips to the front line, repaired tanks under enemy fire, and evacuated damaged vehicles. Once, while repairing a tank in the neutral zone, artillery fire began. Everyone took cover in craters, but Morozov remained with the vehicle. He had to finish replacing the damaged track. He worked calmly and methodically, ignoring the explosions nearby. He finished the job, started the tank, and only then took cover. The vehicle returned to service thanks to his courage. Engineer Mikhail Semyonovich Kovalev led a team that made tank hulls. In November 1941, during the hungriest period of the blockade, he lost his wife and daughter. They died of exhaustion. Kovalev buried them in the Piskaryovskoye cemetery and went back to the factory. He continued to work, led the team, and fulfilled the plan. He said that the best revenge on the enemy was every new tank and every shell. Kovalev endured the entire blockade without missing a single workday. After the war, he continued to work at the factory and raised 3 nephews. Machine gunner of the workers' detachment, Ivan Stepanovich Gromov, was a simple worker in the mechanical assembly shop. When a machine gun company was being formed, he volunteered. During one of the enemy reconnaissance group's attempts to break through to the factory territory, Gromov took up a position in a machine gun nest at gate number 3. Noticing movement in the darkness, he opened fire. A battle ensued. The enemy tried to suppress the machine gun with grenades, but Gromov continued to fire, preventing the enemy from approaching. Reinforcements arrived, and the saboteurs were destroyed. Gromov was wounded, but remained at his post until the end of the battle. The women of the Kirov plant also showed heroism. When many men left for the front or joined work brigades, women took their places at the machines. They mastered male professions, worked on a par with men, and exceeded their quotas. Maria Ivanovna Smirnova, a 22-year-old worker, mastered the profession of welder and became one of the best. She welded armor seams on tank hulls, a job that required tremendous precision and physical strength. Smirnova worked 12 to 14 hours a day and slept right in the workshop. During the blockade, she welded armor for hundreds of tanks. She was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. The interaction between the Kirov plant and the units of the Leningrad front was so close that the border between the plant and the army practically disappeared. The enterprise did not simply produce military equipment, it was integrated into the city's defense system as a combat unit. The factory's workers' detachments were subordinate to the Leningrad Front Command, received combat missions, and participated in operations. Military engineers and officers were constantly present on the factory premises, coordinating production and defense. The Front Command highly valued the Kirov plant's contribution to the defense of Leningrad. Tanks produced at the plant were immediately made available to units fighting on the nearest sections of the front. A direct line of communication was established between the plant's headquarters and the front headquarters. Requests for equipment repairs, weapons needs, and information about the combat situation were transmitted promptly. This allowed the plant's resources to be used as effectively as possible for defense purposes. An artillery division formed from Kirov workers was incorporated into the 42nd Army of the Leningrad Front. The division took up positions on the Pulkovo Heights, a strategically important point from which artillery support was provided for the defense of the southern approaches to the city. The artillery workers fired on enemy positions, suppressed enemy batteries, and repelled tank attacks. The division fought throughout the war as part of the Leningrad Front and then the Third Baltic Front, participating in the breakthrough of the blockade, the liberation of the Baltic states, and the capture of Königsberg. The factory's tank company, equipped with KV tanks, acted as a mobile reserve for the command. When there was a threat of an enemy breakthrough on any section of the front near the factory, the tanks immediately moved there and launched a counterattack. The crews consisted of factory workers who not only drove the tanks, but also knew their design down to the smallest detail. This allowed them to quickly fix malfunctions right in the heat of battle. There were cases when a mechanic driver repaired a damaged engine or transmission right on the battlefield, and the tank returned to service. The front command repeatedly noted the high combat qualities of the units formed from Kirov workers. They were distinguished by their discipline, fortitude, and high morale. The workers understood that they were not defending an abstract homeland, but their own city, their own factory, and their own homes. This gave them special motivation. Many commanders noted that the workers' battalions fought with the same dedication with which they worked at their machines, persistently, methodically, without retreating. The mutual support between the army and the factory was also evident in everyday life. The military helped the factory build fortifications, provided security, and shared food during the hungriest days. The factory repaired military equipment, manufactured non-standard weapons at the request of the front, and provided the army with tools and spare parts. A real combat brotherhood developed between the soldiers and workers. They understood that they were fighting shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy, and that only through joint efforts could they be victorious. The winter of 1941-1942 was the most terrible period of the siege of Leningrad and the most difficult test for the Kirov plant. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. It was so cold in the workshops that the water in the machine cooling systems froze. The oil turned into a viscous mass, and the metal became brittle. But the worst thing was hunger. Bread rations fell to a minimum. Workers received 250 grams per day, and the rest received 125 grams. This was not enough to sustain life. People died of exhaustion right at their workplaces. They would come to work for a few hours, and collapse at the machines, exhausted. Their comrades would carry them to the medical station, but it was often too late. Their bodies, exhausted by hunger and cold, could not withstand it. A funeral team was organized at the factory to take the dead to the cemetery every day. The number of victims grew with each passing day. By the end of winter, the factory had lost thousands of its workers. But production did not stop. Those who were still able to stand continued to work. There was a catastrophic shortage of energy. Power plants operated intermittently, and fuel was scarce. The electricity supply was limited and turned on for a few hours a day, according to a schedule. When the lights went out, the workshops were plunged into complete darkness and silence. The machines stopped, and production came to a halt. Workers used this time to rest or do work that did not require electricity. As soon as the power came back on, everyone returned to their machines and worked until the next outage. Every minute of equipment operation had to be cherished. Transportation in the city was almost non-existent. Trams stopped running due to a lack of electricity, and cars due to a lack of fuel. Workers walked to the factory, sometimes several kilometers, through snowdrifts, in the bitter cold, exhausted by hunger. Many did not make it. They fell on the road and froze to death. But those who did make it got to work. For many, the factory became their home. They lived right in the workshops, sleeping on the floor near potbelly stoves, which they heated with whatever they could find. Wooden boxes, pieces of furniture, wood shavings. Despite all the horrors, the morale of the factory workers was not broken. People held on to each other, supported the weak, and shared their last piece of bread. The factory's party organization held meetings at which they talked about the importance of work, about how each tank brought victory closer. They read reports from the front and letters from soldiers who fought in tanks produced at the Kirov plant. These letters inspired the workers and gave them the strength to continue the struggle. By the spring of 1942, the worst was over. The road of life was organized on the ice of Lake Ladoga, along which food began to be delivered to the city. Bread rations increased. People began to recover and regain their strength. Production at the plant gradually increased. The winter of the blockade was over. The city had survived. The factory had survived. The people had survived. It was a victory of the spirit over circumstances, a victory of man over death. The Kirov factory continued to work and fight. The feat of the workers' battalions of the Kirov factory and other industrial enterprises of Leningrad was of great importance for the defense of the city and the outcome of the entire war. The factories, which had been turned into fortresses, became an impregnable barrier to the enemy. The workers, armed with rifles, defended the gates of their enterprises and showed that the entire Soviet people, from soldiers to machine operators, were ready to fight for the freedom and independence of their homeland. The experience of defending industrial facilities was used in other besieged cities and on other fronts. The Kirov plant continued to operate throughout the blockade, which lasted 872 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944. During this time, the enterprise produced more than 700 tanks of various modifications, thousands of artillery pieces, mortars, and tens of thousands of shells and mines. New types of weapons were developed, adapted to the conditions of urban combat and positional warfare. The plant became a veritable arsenal for the Leningrad front. Many workers and soldiers of the workers' battalions were awarded orders and medals for their labor and courage. Hundreds of factory workers received the medal for the defense of Leningrad, which was awarded to all participants in the defense of the city. Dozens were awarded the Orders of the Red Star, the Red Banner, and the Labor Red Banner. Several people received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union and Hero of Socialist Labor. But the main reward for them was victory, the salvation of the city, and the opportunity to continue their lives and work. After the blockade was broken in January 1943 and completely lifted in January 1944, the plant continued to increase production. Destroyed workshops were restored, equipment was repaired, and evacuated specialists returned. The Kirov plant participated in the production of equipment for the final operations of the war, the liberation of the Baltic states, the capture of Königsberg, and the storming of Berlin. Tanks bearing the plant's mark reached the Reichstag and left their mark there. The memory of the feat of the defenders of the Kirov plant is still preserved today. Memorial plaques, monuments, and museum exhibits have been installed on the premises of the enterprise. The names of the heroes are carved on the walls of the workshops, and their photographs are kept in the factory museum. Every year on May 9th, veterans and factory workers gather to honor the memory of those who died and celebrate Victory Day. The traditions of courage and dedication established during the war are passed on to subsequent generations of factory workers. The experience of defending industrial facilities in Leningrad was summarized and used in military science. The creation of workers' battalions, the integration of production and defense, and the transformation of factories into fortified points all became important elements of the strategy for defending cities in modern warfare. The feat of the Leningrad factory workers showed that industry is not only the economy, but also a weapon no less important than the tanks and guns it produces. The history of the Kirov factory's labor battalions is a story of the power of the human spirit, of loyalty to duty, of the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. It is a story about ordinary people who accomplished the impossible. They worked and fought, starved and froze, died and won. They defended their city, their factory, their country. Their feat will remain for centuries as an example of courage and self-sacrifice, as proof that a people ready to defend their land to the last is invincible.